We have a very interesting and informative program tonight and have about 140 participants in the room so far joining us virtually. My name is Denise and I am a political officer at the U.S. Embassy here in Singapore, and I will be your moderator this evening. The electoral process is an integral part of democracy in the United States because a democratic system supports free and fair elections and encourages citizens to be active participants in politics and society. Americans turn out to vote to have their voices heard and to show their support for the leaders they want making decisions about the future of the nation. Democracy is a shared strength and value for both Singapore and the United States, and our relationship is stronger because of it, which is why we're so pleased to be presenting this program to you tonight. We'd like to thank our event partner, Junior Achievement Singapore, for working on this event with us. We'd also like to thank our very special guest speaker, Dr. Michael Hanahan, who is the director of the University of Massachusetts Civic Initiative. Dr. Hanahan teaches American political thought, American government, campaign finance and reform, and modern political campaigns at the University of Massachusetts. In addition to his teaching role, Dr. Hanahan hosts many exchange programs and has hosted Singaporeans from our very own Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative, or YSEALI, exchange program. A big thank you to you, Dr. Hanahan, for joining us tonight, and we look forward to hearing your presentation on how we pick our leaders. Before we start his presentation, let's hear a few words of welcome from our partner, Junior Achievement Singapore, by Executive Director Hao Yi Ing. Over to you, Hao Yi.
Thank you, Denise. Good evening. It is wonderful to see so many students and young adults attending this webinar to learn more about a topic that is beyond academics or required by the school. Junior Achievement, or JA, is a worldwide nonprofit organization dedicated to inspiring, empowering, and preparing the youths for their future through life skill programs on entrepreneurship, work readiness, and financial literacy, mainly to teach or to expose to students things they normally don't learn in school. All our programs, short 4 to 6 hour long courses, as well as competitions, are offered free of charge and are taught by volunteers from the business world. We partner with various companies and organizations to bring the real world to the classrooms. Thus, we thank the U.S. Embassy for inviting JA Singapore to partner with them to provide another exciting learning opportunity for our students and alums. As Singapore just held its general elections on 10th of July, and the Americans will be voting for the next U.S. president on 3rd of November, I thought it would be good for the students in Singapore to learn how different are the elections process between the two nations. In addition, with the U.S. being one of the top 5 most powerful nations in the world, the presidential elections is one to watch and is of interest to many people outside the U.S. So once again, thank you, U.S. Embassy, for the partnership, and students and alums enjoy learning from this tonight's webinar.
Great, thank you, Hao Yi. So before we turn over the virtual podium to Dr. Hanahan, let's quickly find out how you're all feeling about your U.S. elections knowledge before we start. We are going to use Mentimeter for this poll, and we're going to be using Mentimeter later in the program as well for a rapid fire trivia quiz. So if you'd like to participate, we'd invite you to either click on the link in the chat box or use a second device to go to www.menti.com, M-E-N-T-I, and enter in the code 810720 when prompted. So we'll give everyone a few seconds to get into Mentimeter to start. Okay, here we go. I see it now. How familiar are you with the U.S. electoral process? Okay, so most of you say you know a little bit about it. So hopefully by the end of the night, we will have more folks saying they are an expert. Thank you for everyone for participating in the poll. Before I turn to Dr. Hanahan, I want to quickly note that we have invited Dr. Hanahan to speak as a private U.S. citizen. So his views do not necessarily represent official U.S. government policy, and we encourage the free exchange of ideas during tonight's discussion. Which reminds me, thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance when you registered. We will have Q&A after the presentation, so be sure to submit any additional questions for Dr. Hanahan via the Q&A chat box, which will be open throughout the duration of the program. And now let's welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Michael Hanahan. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm still getting used to talking to people virtually, but we do it here now because all of our universities are closed, as I'm sure you probably know. This is quite an exciting election year, and I'd like to spend the next 40 minutes talking about a couple of aspects of that process. This first slide is just a picture of the conventions, Republican and Democratic conventions in the past. We'll talk a little bit about what a convention is in a minute. November 3rd is our election, 2020. The campaign will be between the Republican President Donald Trump, the incumbent, and his challenger, former Vice President, former Senator Joseph Biden. It's a picture of the two of them. That's the official picture of the president, and that's not a very good picture of Vice President Biden that I chose from the web. The agenda today is what makes the U.S. system different. And I want to emphasize, I wouldn't recommend this system to anyone. It's just the system that we use. A lot of students ask me over the course of the year, why does the U.S. do what they do? And you can ask that of any country, really. And the easiest answer is not very satisfactory. And it is that people do what they do because that's what they did before. And the U.S. system, as I'll mention in a second, is very old. So we often simply do the processes that we do because that's what we're used to, and that's what we've done for a long time. Then we'll talk about the nomination, which is how the parties, of which there are really two main parties, pick their candidate who's going to run for office. We'll then talk about the actual election of the general election and the Electoral College. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about how campaigns are run and organized in the United States. So what's at stake in this election? It's not just the president for us, it's the president, but also 1/3 of the United States Senate, of which there are 100 senators, and every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election or election. The entire House of Representatives, 435 members, many governors in the country, and then many state legislators. I mentioned governors and state legislators. It's not something people in other countries really talk about, but in the US, governors are very important because they're actually more powerful than the president within their state in many ways. And state legislators are the people that ultimately draw the district boundaries for the Congress, so they're also very important. As I mentioned, the House of Representatives, just a quick update, they're currently controlled by the Democratic Party, of which there are 235 Democrats in the House and 197 Republicans. So the Democrats have the House, and because of the number that they have, they almost certainly will remain in control of the House after this next election. In the Senate, the majority of senators are Republicans, although it's quite close. And one of the big questions of this election is, will the Democrats be able to win enough seats to control the Senate in this November 3rd election? What are some things that make the United States different? First of all, our Constitution is just very old, which means that we do, like I said earlier, we sort of do things the way we do them because that's the way we've done them in the past. We're sort of used to certain things like the Electoral College, which is by any standard somewhat strange as a system. We use a presidential system, not a parliamentary system, which means the president is separate from the legislative body. And in fact, the legislative body can be of a different party than the president, which is quite common, and that is the case right now. We generally have a two-party system. I know in your election you had numerous parties, and so do we, but you had really three parties, I guess, that got a significant number of votes. In our system, we have two, and it's been that way for a very long time. And part of that is because of our Constitution, where it's a winner-take-all system. So there's really no motivation for a third party to just get some votes. And finally, one other difference in the US is it's very decentralized, and we fight about it all the time. So we have 50 states, they have a lot of their own power, and there's a constant sort of negotiation either through the legal system or through politics of who has what power. And in the latest situation with the pandemic, there's been a lot of back and forth between who's in charge of the system. So on my slide, it says quiz time.
Okay, so everyone, we thank you for Dr. Hanahan. Thank you for all the insightful comments so far. So if everyone can go back to Mentimeter, we were going to do a quick quiz to see who's been paying attention or maybe who just has the fastest fingers. So everyone, if it can open their Mentimeter window again, click on either the link in the chat box or go to the website and enter the code 108780. There we go. You see people coming in. You'll be asked to enter a username. Feel free to enter your real name or use a pseudonym. We are going to have 3 quizzes tonight, so this is going to be the first of the 3. Whoever answers the questions correctly the fastest will see their name on the leaderboard at the end. So we will do the same after each quiz segment, and then at the very end, the top 3 participant on the leaderboard, they will win a goodie bag of small gifts from U.S. Embassy Singapore. So when we have everyone ready, we will start. Okay, ready. Which are the main parties in the United States? Oh, it's going quickly. Is anyone voting? Okay, there we go. Most people got it 99%. Moving on to the next question. Which below represents a unique aspect of the U.S. system? Let's see what everyone said. Okay, the system of government is very old. Overwhelmingly, everyone got that one right as well. So last question for this round. How many senators does the United States have? Okay, let's see how everyone did. Okay, the answer is 100. It asked about senators. And then I think we will see our leaderboard. Ooh, looks like we have a pretty tight race. But don't worry, everyone. This is just the first round. This is our warm-up. So let's go back to Dr. Hanahan to continue the presentation.
So that was a little background on our campaign system and history. Now I want to actually talk about the elections. There's 3 words I think that are useful to talk about. One is we use the word nomination as the word that we use for the parties, the Republican and Democratic Party, to pick their candidate. So that's the nomination. We use the word election to mean the general election or primary elections run by the government to pick our leaders. And we use the term campaign to mean the activity of the candidates to achieve power. And sometimes we use those words interchangeably, but those are the specific meanings. We're going to talk about all of those today. One thing that's important to note when I mentioned federalism in the US, and this is sort of part of that, is this is definitely to Singapore, I'm sure, going to be an unusual slide. Every state in the United States has different laws about voting. It's up to the states to create laws about voting. The federal government in the Constitution and in constitutional cases usually defines sort of the basics of who can vote, which is all citizens over the age of 18. So what this slide represents is the notion of federalism, and I'm mentioning to the people watching that states around the United States all have different laws about voting. In fact, they're so different, like in some states, for example, Florida, which is down here in the South, if you're a convicted felon in prison, and even after you get out of prison, you cannot vote. Whereas in Massachusetts up here, which is where I live, you can. And some states vote with paper, some states vote with machines, some states vote with the same system statewide. And it's some states require a photo ID when you vote, some states don't. And so that's just kind of an interesting fact about the US. This is another picture representing how federal the United States is. This is a map of Massachusetts. This little town here is where I live, in Amherst. So Massachusetts has 351 cities and towns. And each one of those cities and towns has a different method of voting. So when I go to vote in Amherst, I fill out a piece of paper and OptiScan. If I were to vote in Boston, which would be illegal to vote twice, I would use a machine. So that just goes to show how decentralized the United States system is. And it can cause problems because a lot of different systems, there's always a chance for one to fail. But that's the way we do it. I just mentioned, this is Amherst in the winter, just to give you a view of what it looks like in a different season. It might be snowing on election day, but usually early November is too soon for that. So campaigns are about fights, and it's often uncomfortable to talk about fighting, but it's okay for societies to disagree. I think in the United States, it's pretty well accepted that disagreement is not always bad. I mean, people do sometimes say, why can't they all get along? And why can't they all work together? And that's understandable. But for the most part, societies are divided to some extent, which is why you have politics to begin with. I would suggest that in the United States, and really, you could probably say Singapore, any country in the world, the things that people disagree about include money, who gets the money, how's the money allocated, how do you deal with taxes and inequality, safety. Are you safe as a nation? Are you safe on your streets? Are you safe from the government? And then third, questions of identity. Who belongs? Who's a citizen? What does it mean to be a citizen? Is there such a thing as a real American? And we argue about questions of identity a lot in the US. They come out especially in terms of our immigration debates. Now, all of those fights have different ideas. So there's an idea to deal with immigration one way, there's an idea to deal with immigration another. There's all sorts of different policy ideas, and we argue about that in the public sphere all the time in one way or another, but they all get stuck in one of these two boxes, the Democratic box and the Republican box. So if you think about it, in some systems that have a lot of parties, the negotiation happens after the election, where the parties have to form a governing coalition. In the United States, the negotiations take place really before the election, where the Republicans and the Democrats, even though they disagree among themselves, come together in order to run campaigns to take public power. This is a very simplistic slide here, and as they announced at the beginning, I'm a private citizen, so what I say is not the opinion of the US government. But generally, Republicans have, historically at least, there's been some changes recently, have campaigned on a smaller government, especially federal government, a slightly more aggressive foreign policy, and if not aggressive and interventionist, at least kind of a America first, we'll do things on our own kind of policy. I would say the Republicans are a little less supportive, for example, of international organizations. And that's definitely true of this current administration when it comes to the United Nations. And they tend to attract people in the United States who advocate for what we would call here more traditional morals, which can mean a lot of different things, but they tend to take maybe say abortion, gay marriage, and that kind of issue, certain types of religious prerogative. Democrats, on the other hand, tend to favor more government action. They tend to favor more negotiated foreign policy, and they tend to favor more personal choice when it comes to questions of morals. The United States is a very candidate-centered system, which means that the party doesn't come to people and ask if they run and then put them on a list, and then the party does all of the work, and then the candidate is beholden to the party. Instead, in the United States, a candidate themselves at every level decide to run on their own. And that's why we say run for office instead of stand, which is what you might say in the English system. It's a winner-take-all system. So if a person gets one more vote than the other person, they're the winner. There's no allocation by proportions. And we do have a party system, as I mentioned, with two parties, but the parties really function more as a way to organize government and more as a way to identify ideologies for people so they can make a simpler choice than it does as a system that chooses the candidates and then funds them to run. So what's current right now in the United States? I'm sure for those of you that follow our headlines, you probably see these. The number one issue in the United States is honestly the president. Presidents always tend to control the media because they're an individual and people pay attention to individuals, but President Trump is particularly adept at dominating the headlines. And he generally, if you look at the news every day, the headline will have something to do with the president. Secondly is the pandemic, the COVID virus, which in the United States is still very problematic in many places. I live in Massachusetts, which had a very bad March and April, but seems to have gotten it under control. But then the virus, remember the federalism issue, pops up in some other places. There's been a lot of protests in the United States, usually focused on racism and police behavior. And so in a general way of looking at it, there's a feeling of order versus disorder in the United States, which is a major campaign issue here. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the nominating process for president, the long, strange trip for those of you that are Grateful Dead fans. I mentioned these terms, the nomination, where we pick, the campaign, what the candidates do, and the election, the final choice for those that go into office. This is just a picture. These are the people, which seems like 5.5 to 10 years ago, but it was really only a few months ago. These are the people that were running for president. In fact, they're not all here. I couldn't fit them all. Who are running for president as a Democrat. President Trump had a couple of opponents, but it's very difficult to beat an incumbent president in a primary. So I'm really going to talk about the Democratic primary. And of course, Joe Biden right here is the person that came out as the winner. So essentially, the nominating process picks delegates, which are individuals that are party activists that choose to run in various states. There's around 4,000 of them, according to the rules for the Democrats. So you need around, as it says here, around 1,900 delegates to win. And delegates are selected in a series of complex rules that differ from state to state. If you think about that, that means the United States has 100 different rules and regulations. There's 50 Republicans, 50 Democrats. They have different rules in each state in terms of choosing delegates. I will say it's a very open system in a lot of ways. In most countries, the party is a more closed system. So in England, for example, candidates are actually picked by the Labour Party, a meeting of card-holding Labour Party members. In the United States, it's a much looser system where people, sometimes even of the different party, can go and vote for a candidate in one party or the other. So a candidate has to receive at least 51% of those delegates. Joe Biden, Vice President Biden, has already gotten those. But that process started way back in January and February of this year. It's a very long, very rigorous, very difficult process for candidates. It requires a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of stamina, frankly, on behalf of the candidates. I've worked on primary campaigns with presidents, and I remember it was, I don't want to give up my age, I guess, but it was George H.W. Bush, and I was sort of helped drive him around in New Hampshire. I was just a kid, I guess, but he would take 3 or 4 shirts a day, just to have to change his shirt constantly, because of the work all the time. This is just an example of the early schedule with the Iowa caucus, and I'll talk about a caucus, and then the New Hampshire primary. So this was way back in February, and then the South Carolina primary. And again, these are party-run efforts. The state does do some legal regulation, but for the most part, political parties in the United States are private associations, and therefore they have the right to set their own rules, choose their own members within certain constitutional boundaries. The difference between a primary and a caucus is pretty simple. A primary looks like any election. You walk into a voting booth, they give you a Democratic or maybe a Republican ballot, depending on which one you choose. You vote for the candidate, and that's that. A caucus is a meeting where people get together, candidate surrogates make arguments for the candidate, and then they take a vote and allocate delegates that way. Ultimately, the delegates all come together in giant parties, which is what they are, giant celebrations really of their party. And the Democratic convention was supposed to be in July in Milwaukee, and the Republican was supposed to be in August in North Carolina. But the Democrats have moved theirs to much later because of the virus and have changed their rules. So there won't be nearly as many delegates in the room. The Republicans didn't like the deal North Carolina was giving them, so they tried to move it to Florida. But now Florida is maybe, I think, the worst state in the country for new COVID cases, and they're still negotiating. They don't really want people wearing masks. They don't want people crowded. They don't want an empty arena. They want a big, boisterous crowd. And so that's kind of up in the air right now. Conventions, usually when people go into the convention, they know who the nominee is going to be. So it's not really a drama, it's a show. It's a show to launch the campaign for the next couple of months. The election is in a few months. And it also defines the party agenda, which we call the platform, and sort of tries to define the party to the public by the speakers that they have scheduled. Usually they try to get the best speaker scheduled for prime time so people can see young leaders in the party, try to define the party's visual. And again, after all of that, it's going to be Joe Biden speaking and accepting the nomination at the convention. On November 3rd, again, this is going to be the election, Biden versus Trump. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about the general election. 2016, President Trump got 305 electoral votes. Secretary Clinton, 227. And I haven't talked about electoral vote yet, but that meant that President Trump, then candidate Trump, wins the election. However, candidate Trump only got 46.1% of the vote, and candidate Clinton got 48.2% of the vote. So she won by a couple million votes in a national vote. What's the mystery there? The United States doesn't run their campaigns based on a popular national vote. It runs its campaigns based on 50 popular state votes with a certain system of rules. This is a picture you've probably seen, Electoral College, which I'll talk about in the next slide. The blue states tend to be, blue, but for convention's sake, and I don't know why we made this choice, blue stands for Democrat and red for Republican, which is a little ironic in a way because red is often the color associated with communism or socialism, which is something that the Republicans talk against more than the Democrats. And so you can see that the blue states are the states that Secretary Clinton won and the red states that President Trump won. I'll just point out some numbers in a second. This is the same map, except this one has a link built into it, which I hope works. You'll notice that if you go back to the red map, it looks like President Trump won an overwhelming victory, but in fact, many of these states you see, for example, 4, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. So if you take all of these states here, they still don't have as many electoral votes as the little tiny state of Massachusetts out there. So what is an electoral vote? The states are divided. There's 50 states, and each state is given by the Constitution a number of electors, that are actually real people. And if you want to ask a question about that later, I'll be glad to answer it. I did in 1984 help pick the electors for Massachusetts. That is, the number of electors is equal to the number of Congress people, which is allocated by population, and the number of senators, which is set for 2 for each state. So if you look at Wyoming, Wyoming is big physically, but it has so few people in it that it only has 1 congressperson, Liz Cheney, and it has 2 senators, so it has 3 electoral votes. Whereas California, which is our most populous state, has 54 electoral votes, which means it has 52 congresspeople and 2 senators. That has the effect of making Wyoming a little more powerful mathematically than California, because they both get 2 senators, even though California is much, much bigger than Wyoming. So let's take a look at the current electoral map. This is a website you might be interested in called 270 to win. You need 270 electoral votes to win. The candidate that gets to 270 wins. This current map is what's called the consensus polling map, which is based on a summary and average of all of the legitimate current polls that are out. And it actually shows Vice President Biden winning 278 electoral votes, which is enough to win the presidency, and President Trump at 169. And then these, I don't know what color they show up on your screen, but they're gold, sort of goldish here. These are states that are too close to call right now. Now, anything can happen between now and the election. Things can change. If you want to go to this site and play around with it, it's kind of fun because you can pick a state, and let's say Michigan is a fairly contested state, and you can change it. I'll change it to red, and then you see now all of a sudden, if Michigan goes, then there's not enough votes yet, and President Trump comes closer, and then these other states become even more important. So you can play with this and understand how it works by just clicking. Now I'll put it back to blue, which is where it was, and it gets back up to 278. So the current map, if it were to hold, would suggest that Vice President Biden would win the election. But as I said, polls are just a snapshot, and they can change radically and have changed radically historically. So the Electoral College was a compromise in the constitutional debate. It was a debate between the power of populations versus the power of individual states. Electors in each state are the individuals that cast the final ballot to elect a president. So for example, if Massachusetts goes for Vice President Biden, which it will certainly, then if Vice President Biden wins Massachusetts, which he will, those, I think, 11 electors will show up at the State House. They're all Democrats. They were all picked by the party as sort of hard supporters of the party. And there'll be a ceremony that's a couple hundred years old. They'll fill out a form that hasn't changed for hundreds of years. They'll put it in an envelope. They'll drive it down to Washington. The Congress will open it and then count the votes. So that's the Electoral College. It's really a semi-popular election based on 50 separate elections. And this is an illustration. I use it in Argentina, which is why you have Argentinian province names here. How can you win the Electoral College and lose the popular vote? It's really just a math question. So imagine there's 2 candidates, Mike and Agus, and there's 3 states or provinces, San Juan, San Luis, and La Pampa. And let's say the first 2, Mike wins by just a couple of votes. Because I win, it's a winner take all. I get 3 electoral votes here, I get 3 here. But I lose here, and I lose here big. Maybe that's where she lives. So she gets the home vote. She wins it by 600 votes. I still get the 6 electoral votes, even though I have fewer popular votes. So you can lose the popular vote because your opponent runs up big numbers, as Clinton did in, say, California, Illinois, and New York, whereas President Trump won by smaller numbers in places like Ohio, Florida, and Michigan, but by a smaller number of voters. And it's quiz time.
Okay, so we are on to the second round of our quiz. Let's see how well everyone has been paying attention. So We are going with our first question. How many electoral votes does it take to win? These questions are coming fast, so 1 second left. Let's see how everyone did. Oh, overwhelmingly, most people got it right, 270. That is correct. Last question, which month does the first primary election take place? January, March, May, or February? Correct, February. Most people got that one too. So we are going to see our leaderboard again after the second round. Let's see how everyone is doing, see who is ahead. Okay, the race is tightening up a bit. There we go. We have Ingrid in the lead. A few others following closely behind. So we will have one more round for everyone to catch up at the end of the presentation. So with that, we will go back to Dr. Hanahan. And as a reminder to share the screen so we can go back to the PowerPoint. Perfect. Over to you.
I'm going to have to move a little quickly because I promised I'd do 40 minutes and I've got about 7 minutes left to be able to make that. Presidential elections, now we're really going to talk about the campaign, generally are decided by political party affiliation, sort of the state of the economy, including the international economy, and the character or the perceived character of the candidates. In the United States, this is party affiliation over time. The Democratic Party is a slight majority party over the Republican Party and has been for some time with the exception of this period right here. More Americans than ever register as independents. That's not a party. It simply says they're not affiliated with either the Democrats or Republicans, but that's a little bit of a myth because almost all independents actually almost always vote for one party or the other. Very few people change party vote from one election to another, but enough do to make a difference. Just to give you a quick idea of how Americans are divided, this is the vote between then candidate Trump and then candidate Clinton. You can see that Secretary Clinton got a slightly more in terms of the popular vote, but she won big among women, whereas President Trump won bigger among men. President Trump did better as people got older, although that has changed in the latest polling. President Trump won the majority of white votes, whereas Secretary Clinton won overwhelmingly African-American votes and also a large extent Hispanic votes. An interesting thing down here, one is Black women. If you see that here, the number of votes that exit polls showed President Trump getting was so small that it didn't register as a number. And one thing that's changed in my lifetime is generally Republicans used to do better among the more educated population, and that is actually reversed. And so non-college graduates overwhelmingly voted for President Trump, which is sort of an interesting change, over time. Religion is also a big variable in the United States. And so what we would call even white evangelical Christians, which the term evangelical is vague, but generally it means maybe sort of religiously conservative in many ways. That's not completely right, but I think it's good enough for here. Overwhelmingly voted for President Trump. So part of the president's base are working class white voters, especially men, and religious conservatives. Now, a little bit about campaigns. I'm going to skip this slide just so I can get to this. It makes a nice noise at the end, but I'm going to move on so I can show a couple of commercials. A lot of criticisms of American campaigns have said they're too expensive, but they've always spent money. This is George Washington, our first president. His campaign in 1757 for the delegate house in Virginia. This is before we were free of Great Britain. And it was pretty much all of his expenditures were based on alcohol, which goes to show that his campaign was really a parties held in his district among people who at that time were eligible to vote. But even then, he was spending money on campaigns. Campaigns have always been ugly, although I have to say this particular campaign has already been as ugly as any I've ever seen. But even back in the time of Thomas Jefferson, you can read this: if Jefferson were to win, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will all be openly taught and practiced. The air will be rent with the cries of the distressed, the soil soaked with blood, and the nation black with crimes. So it was negative campaigning even at the beginning of the Republic. So how do you win a presidential campaign? Well, first of all, if you're the incumbent, you can win if you have a really good economy and you don't make a lot of mistakes. But you also need a message. Why should they vote for you? Why should they vote for you now? And why should you not vote for the other candidate? Your message needs to be simple, so it can be processed mentally by a large number of people quickly. Human beings are busy. They're looking for shortcuts mentally so they can make decisions based on signals that they get and not have to think everything through completely. So messages need to be simple, and you also need to repeat them over and over again. That's why candidates have slogans that you repeat. MAGA is everybody in the United States knows MAGA, Make America Great Again. It's just stuck in people's minds for better or for worse. And it was a successful slogan. They need to be repeated. Then you need to target voters. Who are your voters? In the United States, you only need 50% plus one. So it's not about love. You don't have to have everybody love you. You just need to have enough people vote for you in each individual state. In fact, just the key states really, to put you over the top in the election. So who are your voters? An example, if there was a little tiny district of about 100,000, 150,000 people, maybe 105,000 would be old enough to vote. I think it's 21 in Singapore, and I think you're legally required to vote. In the United States, you're not legally required to vote. In fact, you're not even necessarily required to register to vote. So let's say 42,000 of this 105 are not even registered to vote. Registration is a separate process. So 63,000 potential voters. You can look at the voter rolls and see who votes. You can't see who they voted for, but you can see who voted. Let's say 22,000 people hardly ever vote. So you have really roughly 41,000 consistent voters, of which are roughly divided between, say, Republicans and Democrats. So you've got 14,000 people who are regular voters who you might be able to persuade. That just is an example of how campaigns think about targeting votes in order to save money, because every time you send out a piece of mail or buy a television ad, it costs a lot of money. So they really need to target their votes and their locations in order to maximize their resources. What are President Trump and Vice President Biden going to fight about? President Trump had hoped that the economy would be his strength, but now he's going to have to go with division and sort of based on income and race, as well as some disorder. There's a lot of protests and riots in the United States, and there's a feeling among many voters that things are out of control, and President Trump needs to appeal to those voters as the person that can get things under control and make our country safe. Whereas former Vice President Biden, he will run on the president's performance in the pandemic, many of the things that the president has said on a host of issues, and he will try to make the campaign about President Trump. So much so, in fact, that Vice President Biden's really not doing a lot of campaigning. He's simply letting the president take the spotlight and see where things will go from there. And also, in defense of that strategy, it's difficult to campaign right now. The president is the president. So whenever he does a press conference, people will watch it. But you can't really travel around, shake people's hands, have big meetings right now because of the virus. What are some of the implications for this? Well, there'll still be continued unrest in the United States. I think no matter who wins, it won't simply go away. Secondly, domestic issues will be the most important rather than international questions. Trade, China and Russia will all be seen through domestic lenses. So when it comes to, say, trade deals with Singapore or the Pacific Rim, those will be seen through, is it benefiting the citizens of the United States? Biden would probably try to rebuild alliances more in both the Pacific and the Atlantic, relying on more traditional international institutions. Now let's take a look, and this will be the final couple of slides, if I can make them work, of how the things I said about campaigns, how do they come together in an actual ad? So this is one of the oldest and most famous ads from the United States.
One, two, three, four, five, seven, six, eight, nine,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So that ad, which is very old, which is one of the reasons I show it, is somewhat famous in political circles. What's the purpose of that ad? Well, it's pretty clear. The purpose of that ad is that President Johnson wanted to make the public think that his opponent, Senator Barry Goldwater, was crazy. Now, there's no other way to put it. Maybe that seems a little dramatic, but that was what the campaign was about. Goldwater had said some intemperate things about nuclear weapons, and Johnson wanted to make the public afraid of Goldwater and the behavior he might engage in as president. It was a successful strategy, and Johnson won an overwhelming victory in the 1964 election. In fact, the campaign was so effective that Goldwater himself said on television, I saw all of Johnson's ads, and if I didn't know the man so well, I would have voted for Johnson myself. And he referred that he didn't even recognize himself in those ads. That was so bad. And what about some newer ads? Let's take a look at one ad for President Trump and then one ad from Vice President Biden.
All ready to go?
This is a crisis.
This is no time for Donald Trump's record of hysterical xenophobia.
Biden's son inked a $1 billion deal with a subsidiary of the Bank of China.
Wait, we're getting nervous, man. China is going to eat our lunch? Come on, man. They're not bad folks.
Since the outbreak, the Communist Party has been mobilizing overseas organizations to buy local supplies and send them to China.
The growth of China is overwhelmingly in our interest. A beautiful history we wrote together. Banning all travel will not stop it.
The president is right. That travel restriction on China, as every public health official we've talked to said, bought the country time.
Hysterical xenophobia. Xenophobia. I complimented him on dealing with China. I'm not going nuts.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
Seattle's.
There's a lot of interesting things in that ad. The clear message is there's really two. One is that Vice President Biden is maybe not up to being president. They showed some clips of him slurring his words and seeming a little bit out of control. But the second part is that Vice President Biden, according to this ad, is too close to China. So the president's campaign is going to be about the capabilities of Joe Biden, about sort of the left-leaning qualities of the Democratic Party, which was not really a part of that ad, and also the Biden and his family's perceived closeness to China. You may also have noted at the beginning of that was a warning saying there were deceptive comments in that ad. That was because the ad came from a newspaper, I believe the Washington Post, that looks at all ads and then rates them based on their honesty and puts a little disclaimer at the beginning of the ad, which is an interesting service that media can sometimes provide.
I know so many Americans are suffering loss of a loved one, suffering economic hardship. The country is crying out for leadership. Leadership that can unite us, leadership that brings us together. That's what the presidency is. The duty to care for all of us, not just those who vote for us, but all of us. But I promise you this, I won't traffic in fear and division. I won't fan the flames of hate. I'll seek to heal the racial wounds that have long plagued our country, not use them for political gain. I'll do my job and I will take responsibility. I won't blame others. You know, I've said from the outset of this election that we're in the battle for the soul of this nation. What we believe, maybe most importantly, who we want to be, it's all at stake. We stand together, finally as one America, we'll rise stronger than we were before. I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
So that ad was a good summary of where the Biden campaign is going to go, that President Trump is a divisive leader who's not bringing our country together, is not sympathetic to its citizens, even its sick citizens, has not cared much about the citizens during the pandemic, whereas Vice President Biden is going to be an empathetic figure who is concerned with citizens. And, you know, part of that is Joe Biden's personality, so it kind of fits him. He's known as a good listener and a person that sort of gets along in a face-to-face level with people. And he's also a person, if you don't know much about his background, has suffered a lot in his life with the death of a son, the death of a wife, and has had significant issues of suffering, which may have led to increased empathy. So those are really, those two ads show the direction this campaign is going to go. And I think with that, I would say there's another quiz and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay, great. So we can start with our final two questions. Everyone get ready. Pull up your Mentimeter, please. And good luck. Okay. Ready for our question. What is one key strategy for any campaign? Simplicity, maybe a nice tie, throwing big parties, or paying voters? Great, most people got that one right, simplicity. I think throwing big parties was not close, but second answer. So moving on to the last question of the night. Which is the slight majority party in the United States? Is it the Socialists? Is it the Republicans, the Democratic Party, or conservative? Okay, most people got it right. Democratic Party is correct. So with that last question, let's tally up all of the results and see who is going to be our winner. I think it's, there we go. Dylan, hopefully I said that correct, is our winner. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the top three will be receiving a prize package from the U.S. Embassy. So if you can submit a message via the Q&A chat telling us your username, your real name, and your email address, we will confirm with you via private message to coordinate the delivery of prizes. So with the end of the quiz, we have the three winners, Dillian, Rattlesnake, and Leno. Those are the three. So now we can jump into Q&A, which we have about 30 minutes, and I think this is the most exciting part of the evening. We have a lot of great questions already. As a reminder, please put in your questions in the Q&A box. Dr. Hanahan, thank you so much for your informative, really fascinating talk. I want to start out with a few questions from our partner, Junior Achievement. We got this question a few times, and it's a simple one, but the question is, why is it not made compulsory in the United States for every citizen to vote during elections?
Well, we've talked about it, and people do debate it. I think it's a cultural question in the United States. Again, I go back to this sort of unsatisfactory answer, and this goes with somebody else asked about changing the Electoral College. I think I can answer both of those. The Electoral College has been the way it's been for a very long time, and the fact that there is no compulsory voting has been that way for a very long time. And so I think in American culture, telling people they have to vote is something they would just feel like was imposition on their freedom. In other words, the right not to vote is what people would think there was a right not to vote. Also, you have to understand, of course, just the logistical differences between Singapore and the United States. If you're going to punish people or hold people accountable for voting or not voting, about a country of 330 million people, so it might be very difficult administratively to do that. I think a better option would probably be to just automatically register everyone at 18, as opposed to making people go through the process of registration. And the same thing really with getting rid of the Electoral College. People talk about it all the time and probably have for 100 years, but small states benefit from it, so they're not going to get rid of it. And to get rid of the Electoral College would require a constitutional amendment. In the United States, amending the Constitution is very difficult. We haven't had very many since the beginning of our founding. So it's just a long process. It requires a lot of effort from people who are very committed, and you have to win the support of a lot of states. And many of the states don't want to do that. Maybe someday they'll change it. I think it's antiquated, which someone else asked, and I hope they do change it someday. But understand it's just very difficult because it's very difficult to amend the Constitution. Personally, I would be in favor of requiring voting, but only if there was always an option of none of the above. So that way people could at least register a protest vote, even though they had to go and vote.
Great, thank you. We did get a lot of questions about the Electoral College, and you addressed it. I just want to follow up with a few because we got a lot of questions on this. So the question of what explains the durability of the Electoral College system? In your opinion, if it was abolished, what other electoral system would be most suitable? Do you think the Electoral College system would work in other countries? And yeah, I mean, there are a lot of questions along that vein of why does America still have that system, and what could it potentially move towards a popular vote?
Well, I would repeat my previous answer. It's difficult to change the system because it would require an amendment to our Constitution, and the process for amending the Constitution is long and tends to benefit people that want to stop that amendment, because there's a lot of places you can stop it. The United States system is set up to allow states and individuals to stop things. Somebody else asked a question about Mitch McConnell stopping bills and why does one person have so much power? Well, the system is designed so things can be stopped as opposed to things can be done. So the amending process requires the approval of a lot of states, and a lot of states aren't going to approve it because smaller states get more of a benefit, slightly more of a benefit. Now, to answer where would it go from here, individual states could make changes. Massachusetts gets, I can't remember, but I think it's, let's say 11, just for purposes of this conversation. That's by the Constitution. But the state could allocate those 11 however they wanted. So the state could actually allocate electors in Massachusetts on a proportional basis, or they could allocate it based on who won congressional districts. Two states in the country, Maine and Nebraska, do allocate some of the electors based on who wins congressional districts. So there could be some changes at the state level that might move it towards a popular vote. The final question, I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. I mean, nobody would want to adopt our system, the Electoral College. Like I said, we do it because we've just done it for a long time, and it's hard to change.
Mm-hmm. So moving on to another question that came in during the registration. So and I saw this question a few times about independent candidates or third parties. So the question is, what role do third parties or independent candidates play in U.S. elections, given the U.S. the rigid two-party system. And we had a few questions also about, how can a candidate like Kanye West be eligible to register? And so there's some questions about the role of independent candidates or write-in candidates.
Well, first, Kanye West is not running for president. He took his name out a while ago, and I sort of knew he wasn't going to end up running anyhow, which gets to your next question. In order to run for president of the United States, you have to get your name on the ballot. And to get your name on the ballot means you have to get your name on the ballot of 50 different states, because that's controlled by the state. And every state has different laws. Some are reasonably simple. You pay $1,000 and you get your name on the ballot. So in California, the actual presidential election ballot might have 40 or 50 names on it. The only two that matter are the Republican and Democrat. In some states, though, getting on the ballot, New York, for example, very, very difficult, requiring hundreds of thousands of signatures based on proportions of votes by county. So anybody that's seriously talking about trying to run for president in a 50-state race now is they don't know what they're talking about, basically. For sort of organized third parties, of which there are a couple, the Green Party, maybe the best organized third party in the United States, they have regularly put people on the ballot in many places. They have absolutely no chance at all of winning, but they can have a big effect on the election. Bush versus Gore, where Vice President Gore got more popular votes than candidate Bush. Ralph Nader, who was running, I think, as the Green Party candidate, and his name was on the ballot in Florida, got about 20,000 votes. And Al Gore lost Florida by, I think, 64 votes was a final decision. In the last election in Michigan, President Trump won Michigan by 13,000 votes. And the Green Party in Michigan got some number of thousands of votes, just like they did in neighboring Pennsylvania. So a third party candidate, A, very difficult to get on the ballot unless you're organized already all over the country, like the Green Party is. And B, is not going to win, but can influence who does win by taking more votes away from one candidate as opposed to the other. Because remember, it's winner take all. So if candidate Trump wins Michigan by one vote, he gets all of the electoral votes of the state of Michigan. So in that respect, a third party candidate can make a difference.
Okay, thank you. We have a few questions about polling and about pre-election polling and exit polling, which is different in the United States than the system here in Singapore that doesn't allow for exit polls. So the questions are on the pros and cons of election polls, whether they impact the final result, and similarly about exit polling. There was a question about whether or not that real-time affects results.
Well, rather than give the pros or cons, I think I would start by saying that given the U.S. system, especially the way the Supreme Court, has defined free speech, and especially the way that the U.S. Supreme Court has defined campaign speech, it would not be possible right now to craft a law that forbid polling or the announcing of polling. So from just a practical point of view, our current structure of law would not allow that to be stopped. In terms of theoretical conversation, I guess, I believe that the news networks do not release exit polling until that state's polls are closed. And they won't announce a winner of a state until it's obvious who's going to win the state. Now, does that have an impact on voter turnout? It might, and I think it probably does because of our time zones. So if you're announcing votes on the East Coast, which is an earlier time zone, then it might change people's desire to turn out and vote in, say, California or even Hawaii, which is six time zones different than here, and California, which is 3. So in that sense, it might affect voter turnout. In terms of polling leading up to the election, the research is pretty mixed. That there might be a little bit of a bandwagon effect, that the candidate that seems like they're ahead gets even further ahead, but that research is weak and does not really suggest that pre-campaign polls make much of a difference. And remember, candidates are going to take the polls anyhow. They don't pay attention to the horse race polls in the news because their polls are more detailed. And what a candidate's trying to do is learn what voters to target with what message, not who's ahead and who's behind.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you for that answer. Moving on to another question. I'm going to pull together a few that ask about the role of fundraising and big donors. So one question was, how significant is the role of fundraising and big donors in a successful campaign? And we had another sort of related question asking about, what sort of guidelines and regulations are there in place in the U.S. that govern the representation of corporate interests in presidential campaigns, and the impact of lobbying. So I know that's a lot, but I wanted to pull together a few kind of related issues.
That's a separate semester-long class. I'm trying to think. The reason I'm hesitating, I'm trying to think of the quickest way to answer that. When it comes to campaign fundraising, again, I would start actually with the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled, not just once, but many times, that money is equivalent to speech, essentially, that you can't tell people in the United States what they can or cannot put on television. And so the impact of that is we really have two campaign finance systems. There's one system where the money goes to the candidate. That system is very regulated. Everything is reported. You can go on the web and find out where all their donations came from, who donated. You can find out the addresses of the donors. The limits are pretty small. It's about $2,000, $2,500 roughly for an individual to give to a candidate for each election. So that means you can give $2,500 in a primary and $2,500 in a general. That's not a lot of money, really. And then there are certain committees that are set up that give a little bit more money, but the money is limited and it's tracked and it's transparent. The second type of system is money that can come from different sources. It used to be unions and corporations couldn't give. That's under dispute right now. But those are systems where individuals or groups, I notice somebody must really follow U.S. politics because they mentioned the Lincoln Project in one of their questions. But individuals and groups of people can band together, create a committee that does need to report their income and expenses, but they can run media ads, mail, radio, television, et cetera, independent of the candidate. In other words, they can't work directly with the campaign, but they can put out their own message. And there, the money can come from a variety of sources. It can come in much larger chunks of money. So the result is that the free speech decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court have created this double system where when it comes to candidates, their money is limited and transparent. But when it comes to individuals exercising what the court calls their right of free political speech, it is less limited and less transparent. In terms of lobbying, I don't know, lobbying is something that actually takes place in every country in the world, but it seems to have this negative connotation. Essentially, lobbying is individuals and companies who gather together to put their interests in front of the U.S. Congress and make their arguments. Lobbying is very restricted in the United States now. It's very difficult for lobbyists to use money to influence votes. It's especially difficult at the state level in many states like Massachusetts. But any country that allows any kind of freedom will have interests, be they unions, poor people, insurance companies, are going to group together in order to put their interests forward and make arguments to their representatives.
Yeah, thank you. That was I know a pretty big question, and relatedly, actually, someone asked, what exactly is a super PAC? Do you want to follow up and sort of define what a super PAC is? Since it sort of relates.
It's a little misleading, I think. First, you need to know what's a PAC, I think would be the start. A PAC is what's called a political action committee. And political action committees were actually formed as a campaign reform. After the Nixon years, there was a lot of money floating around in the Nixon campaign. Not necessarily illegally, but they wanted to pass campaign finance laws. And so one of those was allowing groups of people to form what's called a political action committee, where the money, again, had to come from individuals, not corporations, not unions, but individuals who are dedicated to some particular thing. So, let's say the mechanical workers union might form a political action committee, and the union could not donate money to that committee, but its individual members could donate money, and then that political action committee would raise money, and then it would give money to the candidates around the country that it supported.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a political action committee. The last time I looked, they were required to give $5,000 was all they could give per campaign, which would be 10,000 primary, 5,000 primary, and 5,000 general. A super PAC is really the same thing as a political action committee, except that it is not money that goes directly to candidates. They use the money to put on their own political campaigns, and there the money is pretty much unlimited and can come from any source. For example, the Koch brothers, which is a wealthy brothers, I guess, they put a lot of their own money into a political action super PAC, and then they do advertisements against or for candidates. It's at the point, it's so ridiculous, you can't even say, like at the end of the ad, don't vote for Mike Hanahan. But you can make an ad that's pretty clear they don't like Mike Hanahan.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you for that answer. I'm moving on and lumping together a few other questions related to the sort of the buzzwords around fake news and disinformation. A few people asked about one question. Let me find the question. What sorts of efforts are being done in the United States to combat the phenomenon of fake news or disinformation? And relatedly, a few people asked about foreign interference. What does the U.S. do to sort of prevent interference in the electoral process?
Well, that's another big question.
Yeah.
This is serious, very serious question. It might be one of the most serious questions that face democracies all around the world. I say democracies primarily because when you think about it, democracies ultimately only rest on a citizen's trust in information. If citizens cease trusting any information, then they'll believe, whatever they hear from, like a friend or some kind of source like that, which can be okay, but it can be pretty negative. And the internet, social media especially, has really magnified what's an old thing. I mean, there's always been propaganda, right? But the internet has really let the conspiracy theories out of the barn in many ways. And there are ways you can try to fight disinformation. And by the way, when I say fake news, I don't mean just something I don't agree with. That's, I think, often what some politicians use the term fake news. What they really mean is something that was negative about me, even though it's super true. That's what a lot of people use the word fake news about. But I mean genuine bad information. So what do we do? Well, one example you saw earlier, I showed the ad from the Trump campaign that was reviewed by the Washington Post. So the media has some role in going through ads and just highlighting this isn't true. This fact is not true. This fact is not true. And the media has done that to a greater or lesser degree. Twitter does that to a degree. They recently have banned certain information tweets from a group called QAnon, which I'm not going to go into, but it's a conspiracy theory group that tends to support President Trump. And so they police their own playground. Facebook's supposed to do that, police their own playground, but they don't always do it as much. In terms of foreign interference, it absolutely happens. There's no doubt about it. There's no doubt among any serious observer or researcher that the Russians heavily interfered in our last election, not in terms of faking votes or hacking into our election machines, but in terms of using social media to suppress the vote in some areas and to increase the vote in others to benefit the election of President Trump. There's a lot of doubt and uncertainty and argument about the extent to which that campaign was complicit in that, but let's just say they weren't. There's still no doubt that the Russians did what they did and that they're going to do it Again, and from the Russian point of view, it makes sense. It's sort of asymmetrical warfare in a way. If you look at it from an international relations point of view, maybe we're going to be better prepared for it, but I don't think the government has done much to combat it. And so really it's up to the private industry, which is social media, and then the newspapers and media to try to police themselves. But that's a very serious question. And I think our country needs to do a much better job at information literacy in high school and college in terms of how do you evaluate your news sources, what are things to look for that are obviously fake, why it's probably better that the New York Times, which has paid trained journalists, is putting a story out as opposed to some random blogger who doesn't have any resources to investigate on the ground.
Great, thank you. Yeah, you're correct. That's it's a serious and it's a big question. Thank you for that really thoughtful answer. I think we'll probably have time for about two, maybe we can squeeze in two more questions. I'm combining a few questions related to COVID since it's timely. A few people asked about the impact that the pandemic will have on the election in terms of could it potentially impact the campaign? How is it impacting the campaigning? The person asked and/or voter suppression. So could you sort of speak a bit about the impact of the pandemic on sort of the voting process and how you see it impacting the election?
Well, I suppose that the pandemic is going to affect the election. First of all, I think it's an issue that will sway voter choice. In other words, it affects the election because it is an issue. The government's response to the pandemic is a major political issue right now in the U.S. And it's not helping the president. The president's approval ratings on the handling of the pandemic are almost 65% of Americans disapprove of the handling of the virus. That could change if they have some successes, or if he can change the narrative to a different issue. So the first way the pandemic will affect the election is as an issue. The second way it might change the election is voter turnout, because people, I suppose the argument might be that people would be afraid to come vote. I have not seen that in the primaries. I think people in the United States right now, and I think this is unfortunate, really, but people are very divided and very angry, more so than any election I've seen in my lifetime. And they're going to turn out to vote. People are going to vote. They'll go through whatever they need to go through to get out and vote. A lot of states you vote by mail already, so people will vote by mail. I got my voter application in the mail yesterday. I'm going to vote in person because I like to, but I could vote by mail if I wanted. I do think it isn't probably the Republican Party, being the kind of minority party, will do what they can to make it slightly harder to vote. They've already closed polling places, making lines longer, and they're, for reasons I can't fully grasp, opposing vote by mail, even though a lot of Republicans' campaigns have successfully used vote by mail. So I think in terms of turnout, its effects are just hard to predict, and I don't know what it'll do. Maybe some people speculate the older vote will be suppressed a little bit, but I just don't know. I think it mainly is going to function as an issue. I think in the longer term, the pandemic will actually make people think again about governmental competence. For years, both parties to some extent have attacked federal government, big spending, the government. And I think the needle may swing back a little bit, and we may say, hey, maybe we do need to have a competent response to things like a pandemic. So that's a longer term potential effect.
Mm-hmm. And I want to quickly note for our participants that we will be releasing a summary video of this event, and we hope to address some of the questions that we couldn't get to in that video. So follow U.S. Embassy Singapore social media for more announcements, and just want to let folks know that we see all of your questions, and we will do our best to address them in some of our later material. Sorry, I'm pulling up this is a bit of a subjective question, but one participant asked, in your opinion, what would be the single most important topic that's going to come up between Trump and Biden in this election?
Oh, I think there are three. One is the question of character. I think President Trump himself will be an issue. And I think that's partly of his own and his campaign's making. So the president and how he communicates to the public and his tweets and his speaking, the perception that he is attempting to divide the electorate as part of his strategy of winning will be an issue. On the Biden side, they'll attack Vice President Biden through his son Hunter in terms of questions of potential corruption in China and in the Ukraine. When President Trump was mentioning China in the earlier ad that I showed, that was an indication that he's going to use China as the bad guy. He doesn't call it COVID, he calls it the Chinese virus. And he called it worse things too that I'm not even going to repeat on this. But so I think the character of the two candidates will actually be the most important issue. The other issues are pretty obvious. They're the pandemic. They're the massive unemployment that has been caused by governmental decisions and the pandemic, the response to the pandemic, and then the disorder and protests that are going on in many cities around the United States.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. And we had a few, and I'm gonna again combine a few questions about sort of scenarios where what happens if a president declares an election as a fraud or unfair, or potentially refuses to leave the White House. So there were a few questions about, what kind of, what happens if certain electoral, members of the Electoral College vote for the other party. So are there any kind of, I'm trying to think of the right way to say it, but, low probability, high impact events or items or things in the system that could?
I think I'll start with the Electoral College. The Supreme Court has recently ruled that states are allowed to pass laws that require the electors to vote for whoever won the state. The likelihood of an elector voting for somebody else is very, very small. It's only happened a couple of times in our modern history. The people that are picked as electors, as I said, I participated in that process. It was on the Republican side. In 1984, President Reagan won Massachusetts, and I think we had 13 electors at the time. It changes over time because of population shifts. The 13 people were picked because they were hardcore Republicans. They were people that work for the party, officials of the party, donors to the party. So the chances of them going and voting for someone other than the person that won the state is infinitesimal. There's two ways that when President Trump gets asked, are you going to accept the results of the election? There's two ways you could look at that. One is the answer is no, but he's still going to leave. And, the Republicans have criticized Secretary Clinton for not accepting the results of the election, meaning she thinks that maybe she should have won the election. Maybe a lot of candidates feel that way. A more serious issue would be, would the president somehow refuse to accept the results of the election? And actually that's a congressional task in the end. There are certain scenarios where legal cases against the voting in a particular state, let's say a state that was particularly close, might delay the seating of those electors and therefore change the results of the Electoral College. Those are pretty slim chances, but I suppose a possibility. I mean, after the last 3 years, I wouldn't discount anything, but it would be difficult to do that. It would require Congress, and it would require the newly elected Congress would make the decision about whether to accept the electoral votes or not. There's a whole scenario that I've written. I could send it along if people are curious about it.
Great, thank you. I think we've come up on our hour and a half. There are so many great questions, and we will try to address them. Like I said, there'll be a short a video that we'll release after the event. So Dr. Hanahan, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to Junior Achievement Singapore as well for partnering with us. Dr. Hanahan, do you have any concluding remarks?
Well, I want to thank everyone for attending and showing your interest. You're answering the questions suggested. You probably would do better than my students would. And thanks to the embassy and the staff for helping me along through this process, including pointing out that I wasn't sharing my screen at the beginning. And thanks also to Junior Achievement. I meant to mention that when I was in high school, I was a Junior Achievement volunteer for middle school kids in my hometown of Springfield, Ohio. So I was glad to see that it's still an active organization.
Great, thank you. This has been a really, really great event. It makes me almost wish I could go back to school and study political science again. We have put up a short survey link in the chat for folks as they're leaving if they want to click on that and kind of give us some feedback on their way out. We are looking forward to an exciting few months leading up to November 3rd. And again, thank you, Dr. Hanahan, for your very insightful remarks. Thank you to Junior Achievement for partnering with us, and thank you to everybody for joining us tonight.
Take care.
And we hope it's been interesting and informative for everybody. Thank you. Good night.
Hello. I'm glad you guys sent me some additional questions from the talk that we had a little while ago, which I really enjoyed and thought the setup was very nice, and it was a welcome opportunity for me to do that. There were some additional questions, so I thought I'd give those a shot. I'm just going to do it simply. You might remember this was the initial slide to our talk, but you guys added some questions. So what were they? First, can you explain what a faithless elector is? And this is a double question. And the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. First, a faithful elector is an electoral, a person who is nominated as an elector and their candidate wins the state. So they're supposed to then go to the state house and sign a piece of paper voting for that candidate. Let's say they're a Democrat. And for some reason, the person decides to vote for someone else. That's called a faithless elector. It's happened very rarely in our history, and it is illegal in almost every state for someone to do that. I suppose it's possible, but it just doesn't happen. And if it did happen, it would be illegal, and the person would be fined pretty severely for that. The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, very obscure question. To be honest, I wasn't sure what it was myself until I looked it up. But remember that states are allowed to allocate their electoral votes however they want, but they only get a certain number of electoral votes. So if your number is 11, you can't have 10 and you can't have 12. You have 11. And you can allocate those in a variety of different ways. So a number of states, mostly bigger northeastern states, have come to an agreement that if a certain number of states agree, they will award their electoral votes to whoever wins the national popular vote. So, for example, Massachusetts is in that compact. If the Democrat wins Massachusetts right now, then the Democrat gets the electoral votes for Massachusetts. If they were to change that rule with the national popular vote compact, then Massachusetts, and a Republican won the country, then Massachusetts' electoral votes would need to go to whoever won the national popular vote. Turnouts in local elections are always lower than the presidential and national elections. Just because I think national elections engage people more. Even though I think the question is right, your lives are often more affected by decisions made at the local level. But in fact, the news coverage, television, newspapers, radio, internet, usually focuses on bigger national questions, which often are more emotional and more immediate for people. The national elections spend a lot more money Therefore, people are more aware of it because of the television ads and the get out the vote ads. And I think those are the reasons national elections have higher turnouts. Campaign manager and campaign strategist or political strategist, very good question. Generally, a campaign manager is just what it says. It's the individual who manages everyone who works for the campaign. They manage the scheduler, they manage the consultants like the pollsters, they manage vendors like people who make phone calls, they manage volunteers, and they often have to manage the candidate too, which sometimes is the hardest job of all. Whereas a political strategist is a person that a campaign generally hires to help strategize a larger political messaging, targeting, etc. for the campaign. So often a political strategist might be a campaign consultant, whereas a campaign manager is a person that literally manages the money, the finances, the hiring and firing of people. And on lower level campaigns, not presidential, but lower level campaigns, they're often the same person. But on very well-funded campaigns, they're usually different. They're usually different people. New voting techniques. First of all, I have to admit that I don't know what an iBallot is. Maybe it means internet ballot, and if that's what it means, we don't have those yet in the United States. When it comes to mail-in ballots, they're not new. Mail-in ballots are quite old, actually, in the United States. I believe soldiers in the Civil War voted via mail-in ballots. They certainly also did in the Second World War. And in fact, some states, Oregon is one of them, they don't even have physical polling places. Everybody does mail-in votes there. So it's pretty common. It varies from state to state. It's a political issue in the United States right now because the Republican Party tends to believe that the Democrats will benefit if there's an increase in mail-in voting. Because remember what I said, the Democrats are a slightly majority party. And so therefore talking about mail-in ballots like they're new and they're bad, which neither of those is true. They're not bad and they're not new. But they do, according to some people, think that it might benefit the Democratic Party if more people vote by mail. I think that's really open to question. Most of the technologies that have been developed to increase vote by mail were first pioneered by the Republicans. And they get a lot of vote by mail. What would need to happen to enable political parties other than the Republican and Democratic parties to gain more votes? Well, the biggest problem, as I said earlier, is that it's a winner-take-all system, so there's no proportional representation. If a state were to make a change in the way it allocates its electors and give a proportional representation, then if three parties were on the ballot and the third party candidate got a certain percentage of the vote, they would get a certain number of electoral votes. They probably still wouldn't win. As it is right now, it's hard for me to imagine a third party arising in the United States. It's easier for me to imagine one of the two major parties undergoing a serious failure and then having to reconstitute its personnel, its candidates, and its message to people. And it's possible some third party might arise temporarily that would sort of pull the party along in a particular direction. Then eventually, though, it would get absorbed by that party. That's sort of been the history of third parties in the United States. So, November 3rd, 2020, let's see what happens. If you have any more questions, the embassy will have my email address. Thanks, and take care.